So, Kerry, what does Australia Day mean to you?
It's a really hard day. It's one of those days that, as an Aboriginal person, I'd rather forget about. But the English side of me, feels really, I don't know, it's hard to explain. I'd rather I get off the socials. I don't want to interact with people. I think the minority side of me, being my Aboriginality, wants to have the biggest voice in it all. And I can't wait for it to change. For 150 something years, we as Aboriginal people have been asking for it as a day of mourning. And yet there's so much tradition around it since 1994. It's a really strange space to be in. Yeah.
Why is it contentious for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Because of that day of mourning side of things. It's in, what was that, 1938, Aboriginal people started holding it as a day of mourning, which was exactly 150 years after the first fleet arrived. And yet we don't seem to get the recognition as Aboriginal people of what that day actually means to us. Prior to 1994, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people celebrated the 26th of January on the Saturday following that. Yet it seems to hold so much tradition since 1994. So it's hard to understand why people don't listen to us when we say we need you to actually understand where we are coming from, and that day is very confrontational.
What are ways in which early childhood educators could educate staff and kids about the true histories of First Nations people?
Be open and honest, not shy away from the day and what it actually means. Explain to children that some people may see it as Indian Day, some people may see it as Survival Day, whilst lots of non-Aboriginal people see it as Australia Day. Don't be afraid to see the different ways in which people acknowledge that day. One of the services that I work with, they put out a survey to all families and asked what are some of the celebrations you have, and one of the parents responded with, we acknowledge Invasion Day. And the staff member asked me, how do I handle that? And I said, you have the relationship with the parent. Ask her as the parent why and how we as a service can help in acknowledging that for that Aboriginal child.
So, Tristan, what does Australia Day mean to you?
Australia Day. I've thought about this question quite a bit. Look, to be completely honest, Australia Day, like the term and the word and the holiday in general, actually means very little to me, to be completely honest, especially being an Aboriginal man. Like, I've always known it, and we've always called it in my family Invasion Day, and being an Aboriginal man, the concept of celebrating a date that celebrates the first Europeans arriving in Australia and destroying the lives of countless generations of Aboriginal people is actually really baffling to me.
So, Tristan, why do you think it's a contentious date for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Look, I think it's a contentious date for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for the reason I just gave before. The lives of countless Aboriginal people and their descendants have been utterly destroyed by European settlers over the centuries, And for many, celebrating this date in which Europeans invaded and went on to kill countless Aboriginal people, steal their lands, turn this beautiful country into white Australia, is a painful reminder of past trauma and generations of pain and poverty.
Question: what are ways in which early childhood educators educate other staff or kids about the true histories of First Nations people?
Yeah, well, I've thought about this too. And how about learning the history from the actual original source? Instead of early educators, Googling information, how about actually making time to seek out and speak to Aboriginal Australians and listen to their stories? I would suggest staff members contacting their local Aboriginal co-ops or gathering places and request for a guest speaker, such as an Aboriginal auntie or uncle, to share their history and the stories. And for all staff to seek cultural awareness training and appreciation training.
Hey, Bindi, what does Australia Day mean to you?
To me, it's a day of mourning, like a lot of our mob. It's a sad day. And I know that, a lot of the non-Aboriginal Australians look to celebrate, and a lot of them do. A lot of them are our allies now who, wish to take that day of mourning with us. I work with a lot of non-Aboriginal people and often get asked, why don't I celebrate Australia? We're all trying to move towards reconciliation, but in a way that they can understand. I often ask them, do they expect the people or the victims of the Holocaust to celebrate, a particular day, or the day that, or the timing of the Holocaust? So, it's a sad day.
So why is the 26th of January so hard for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Because it's re-traumatising us by asking us to celebrate a day that, many of our families were broken down, murdered, raped, stolen. It's just a difficult day in general, and to continuously want to celebrate a day that's traumatising for us is painful.
So organisations and councils that have, changed the date, how do you feel about that?
I would love the date to be changed, because I do want to get to a point where we all can celebrate a day and, try and work together and move forward so that we are that step closer to reconciliation. I'd love to be, a united party.
Yeah. What are ways in which early childhood educators could educate staff and kids about the true histories of First Nations people?
By firstly talking to First Nations people and getting educated and finding out what it does mean to us and why it's so difficult, so that then with their understanding they can pass that on to our next generation who, taught properly from the early age. I think we'll have a better Australia in the future. Because, when we were in school, we weren't taught what was right. And, half the time we were popping up our hands and saying, hey, that's not what our parents are telling us.
Mm. Do you think it's hard for non-Indigenous people to grasp the true histories?
I think for some, and I think for some, it's what they're taught in their home as well. If their parents have a particular opinion on what the history is, and you're taught that at home, you're never going to believe anything else because it's what you've been taught, unless you've gone out there and lived it, or, you've connected with a community and actually found out the truth for yourself. It's not going to change.
Yeah. So, Alex, what does Australia Day mean to you?
It's pretty complicated, isn't it? It's certainly not a day that I celebrate. I've never really been a fan of the holiday, even before it became kind of really well known that it's not an appropriate date to celebrate. But particularly, it just feels needlessly divisive to commemorate a country that I'm sure we're all pretty happy to live here, really, but choose a different date to celebrate that fact, I think, is just the core of my belief around the whole thing. Yeah.
Why do you think it's contentious for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Well, I mean, it's the history, right? If you've got a date that we're celebrating Australia and you choose the date that colonizers first landed, you think, is that actually what we're celebrating? Because when I think of Australia, that's not the part that I'm celebrating and proud of. So why is that the date that people are so hell-bent on holding on to, especially given that it's quite a recent date that we chose to hold our National Day on?
Yeah. So what are some ways that an early childhood educator could teach kids about dates like January the 26th and other Indigenous dates?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because in my practice, I work at a sessional standalone kindergarten where we actually avoid the date altogether. It always falls before term 1 begins. And for me, that's actually a huge relief, because I have a majority of the families at my service are migrant families, and January 26th is the day that a lot of citizenship ceremonies take place. So for a lot of my families, it is a really culturally meaningful date for them, and I don't want to take away from that really special date by reminding everybody that actually it's also a really, harmful, negative date. So I'm really lucky personally that I sort of just get to go, oh,
Yeah.
it happened before we've started kindergarten. It's beginning of the year, lots of transitions. Oh, I guess it's too late to talk about it now. So for me, that works. But for people in long daycare services, where that's a public holiday, it's a day off, but the children are still attending right before that date and right after that date, it does become so much more complicated, especially when you're working with, 3 and 4 year olds who are, talking, and you can have conversations with them, but that conceptual thinking is really difficult when it's something intangible like a date. And I just think that some of the easiest things to do are acknowledge it, and do mention it, talk about it briefly. But there's only so much you're going to get out of, a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. And I actually think the responsibility is more talking to families about dates like this than it might be talking to children about dates like this when they're too young, specifically. Yeah.
What are some ways that you could talk to your colleagues about some of these dates?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because obviously when we get back, people will say, oh, what did you do for Australia Day? What did you do for this? And I'll often say, I actually don't call it that. I actually just call it January 26th, or I call it Survival Day. And it's really tough, because no one changes their behavior because someone's, judging them. People change their behavior because they're motivated by doing the right thing. So I find that, yeah, you can point out like, oh, maybe it's not the best day to celebrate, especially if people were doing activities in the workplace with children. But personally in the workplace, I'll just say, oh, no, I don't really do anything on that day because of, the negative history associated with that date. I'd prefer to celebrate Australia on a different day. And I just sort of leave it at that.
What does Australia Day mean to you?
Well, I'm a migrant myself into Australia, and in 2007 I became an Australian on Australia Day. And so it's quite significant for me, because it means to me that I'm feeling belonging as an Australian and a Dutch person. But over that time since then, I have learned a lot about and understand about the truth and truth telling. And I wasn't aware of that in 2007 at all. But since then, hearing the stories and fortunately seeing it in the news and educating myself, I've celebrated Australia Day each year differently, because I felt it was uncomfortable being on that date.
Why do you think it's a contentious date for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? What's your understanding?
Well, my understanding is what I've learned, that it's Invasion Day, and that on that day, for many Aboriginal people, it is a day that is filled with a lot of hurt, because it sort of marks the start of colonisation, and colonisation has caused so much hurt to Aboriginal people, that I think that if we celebrate that day on that date, which represents for so many people that start of white Australia, that why should we be hurting the First Peoples by continuing to celebrate on that day? So I think that's why it's contentious.
Question, what are ways in which early childhood educators could educate staff or kids about the true histories of First Nations people of Australia?
So I compare this to the 100 ways, and there is a approach in early childhood called Reggio Emilia, and it talks about the 100 ways of expressing yourself. Well, the 100 ways of learning about the truth is so complex too. So I think you can either go and watch little cuz videos or the play school episodes on the acknowledgement, and you can start really going to the children's books and storybooks. But you can also, on top of that, find all those videos and on your website as well, and educate yourself about the histories and those truths. So there's such a big layers and so many avenues that you can find your way to do the truth telling. But to have every staff meeting you have together to talk about a topic and embed it that way, I think is a really good way. So there's no one way, but there's many really good videos that help understand that truth telling and of the true history. Sometimes it gets overwhelming, but just to chip away and share with each other what you're learning and becoming part of networks, Facebook groups to learn and understand. It's a very complex answer.
And that is, what does Australia Day mean to you?
Oh, makes me sick. Makes me really sick. I've been very honoured and humbled to be working with Aboriginal communities in early childhood, and I was told exactly what it meant to them. And I'm such a white person that I wouldn't have even thought of it, how it affected them. But also I did know that the 26th of January is Mourning Day, and that's been around since about 1930 something. Yeah, no, I don't believe in it at all.
What do you think Aboriginal people might think about Australia Day?
Oh, see, I find that difficult to talk about what Aboriginal people think, but because of what they've told me that they feel like they're nobody. They feel like they don't exist. They feel like they're just always pushed over. They feel like they're always being told what to do. It's not. Only from what they've told me, AJ. I don't want to talk for them. They're strong communities. I don't need to talk for them.
What are ways in which early childhood education could educate other staff or kids about the true histories of the First Nations people? Okay, I am very strong on this. They must read. They must read books written by Aboriginal authors. And there's the Macquarie Pen Anthology of Aboriginal protest letters and stories. That's a great way to start. Actually understand and feel where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are coming from. That would be the first thing. Understand, listen. And look, a lot of us like talking, but listening is better. There's so much you can do by just doing something yourself rather than just going up to another Aboriginal person saying, well, can you just tell me about to me, that's wrong. Learn first. Be respectful. Yeah. And how about teaching kids in classrooms?
That should be, again, from Aboriginal families or Aboriginal locals in the area who live around the area. There's Aboriginal cooperatives. Find out from them and see if they will come and organise for them to maybe do some activities, but don't do just things off your back. You don't know. You don't know. So read stories. There's some beautiful stories out there to the children, and you can answer questions best you can, but you need to go to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
So, Nicole, what does Australia Day mean to you?
AJ, Australia Day, I'm going to answer that in two parts if I can. Initially, Australia Day, growing up in Australia and, spending my whole childhood here and doing my schooling in Australia, Australia Day was something to celebrate, right? In my journey over the last, many years, it's no longer a day of celebration. In fact, I find it a really horrid day. It's a day that comes with a lot of trauma for many people, and I think the audacity and the ignorance that was shown on that day is something that we forever need to work hard at being apologetic for. I think, that's what. For me, AJ, it's not a day that should be recognised as a day that we have fun and celebrate, when it's really a painful day for many people.
Yeah. Going on from that, why do you think it's a contentious date for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
I see it as a day where, it is Invasion Day. That's how I see it. It's a day where, the lens of colonisation was thrust upon Aboriginal people, and that in itself, that particular day of invasion, is something that I know in my work with educators, they're not sure whether they should touch on that. And I always say that you can't commit to reconciliation if you are not speaking the truth. And you can absolutely, and you should be, including that in education and care for children of all ages. And so I encourage educators to talk about it so that it's relatable to children. And a great educator that I know in Nillumbik, I've heard her recently talking to children about Invasion Day, and she was saying, think about it as if somebody came into your bedroom and told you to get out, and you needed to go, and you might not be able to stay with the rest of your family, and you can't take any of your belongings. And AJ, I thought, that was such a relatable thing, the empathy and the understanding that children that were 3 and 4 years of age in that group, they truly, they were relating to what Desi was saying to them. So that for me, I guess, is, and it's still, AJ, in the education and care sector, as you come towards the start of January and people are using social media to post about what should we create, what should we make for Australia Day, and there's so much unlearning and learning to be done that I think that if that date could be changed, I think it would make many people feel a little better, perhaps.
Yeah. What ways do early childhood educators or yourself, how have you tried to raise or talk to kids about Australia Day?
I think what we need to do is talk about respecting other people, and I've gone from that angle when I'm mentoring people and they ask me how should we broach this topic. I said you need honesty and you need truth telling in your curriculums when it comes to this day. And so I have suggested that they talk about rights to feeling safe, rights to your belongings, rights to your language, rights to your culture. People feeling safe comes with many, there's lots of ramifications for being safe. And so I think when we use emotions and inflicting on other people's rights and taking things from them, I think that's a really good underlying foundation for discussions and dialogue around this day.
So, Sandra, what does Australia Day mean to you?
Okay, well, Australia Day is quite controversial at the moment, but I would say for many it's a celebration to be part of a wonderful country, Australia. And for me, that's what it was. That's how I celebrated Australia Day for many, many years. As I was educated at a time when we were not given the truth. The truth wasn't told through the real history of colonisation and the impact that it had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. But I have to say that even though there was no truth given, there was always just something. There was a gut feeling that I had that there was just something that just didn't settle well for me. So in answer to your question,
Why do you think it's contentious for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Well, because it's a day of invasion, isn't it? You know, it's certainly not a celebratory day for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I mean, the world as they knew it, life as they knew it, became disrupted and taken away from them. There was carnage, you know, people died. They were trying to protect what they knew was their life and the way that they lived, and all of that was taken away from them.
In what ways could early childhood educators educate other staff or kids about the true histories of First Nations people?
Well, I think that's a really great question. And I think it needs to start with educators taking on some responsibility to educate themselves. And I think they need to understand the real history, because I don't think that you can educate if you don't know yourselves. And there's a saying that I use that you don't know what you don't know, and that's okay. But you need to do something about what you don't know.